So, good morning and happy Labor Day. We have George Santos here visiting us, and we also have the Speaker of the House, Mr. McCarthy, is also here with us. It's nice to have both of you back together, and it's nice to see that the two of you seem to be getting along pretty well right now. So, George, sticking your tongue out is not all that funny, okay? I just was saying it's so nice to see the two of you getting along so well, and then you have to start up. And you know Kevin, he's Irish, and he'll respond to any kind of provocation. So, peace be with you. So, speaking of peas, I hope you enjoyed your Labor Day dinner. I went to the Union picnic, and there were no peas, but there were baked beans and some barbecue stuff, and so on and so forth, and lots of interesting people, and I enjoyed it very much. So enough about me. That'll be the day, right? Okay. So yes, I know modesty's not my strong suit. If it were, I wouldn't have all these opinions. I wouldn't be so opinionated. If I were so modest, I'd say, well, yeah, my opinions aren't really worth anything. I can't say that and then share them with you, because then I'd be a hypocrite. So, it's Labor Day, and I'm looking at all these polls saying that the American people really are so upset with Joe Biden's handling of the economy, because the American people believe the economy is a complete mess, and the biggest problem they have is inflation, and the biggest inflation problem they have is gasoline. And related problems like airline fares, and then related to travel generally is the increasing cost of hotels and yada yada yada. So I'm seeing this from the polls, and yet I turn on my television today, and there we have once again record travel over the Labor Day weekend. Record travel, record airline flights, record people driving their cars and filling up their tanks with gasoline. And it's not just over the Labor Day weekend, it's been all summer like this, and they expect it to go on into the fall. So I'm saying, how can that be? How can all these people be spending all this money on gasoline and airline tickets and hotels and everything else, and particularly for like a 3-day weekend, at the same time complaining that the costs are so high? Well, this is not inflation. I've discussed this before, but you know, I took a lot of economics in college. I played 3 years in Michigan. I'm not bragging, I'm just telling you I have a basic understanding of economics from my background in calculus, from my father's teaching. My father was an economist as well as a lawyer and a bunch of other things. Good things. But I understand the definition of inflation, as anybody with a background in economics does. And it's not high prices. High prices can be a result of inflation, but it's not the definition of inflation. Inflation is when you have too much demand chasing too few goods. And what that means is, if that happens, prices on those goods go up, because it's like a bidding war. So you end up with, first thing you have is shortages, like gas lines, or toilet paper disappearing from the dumbest thing I ever saw in my life. Everybody ran and rent, bought all the toilet paper because of COVID. But first you have lines, and you have shortages. And then what happens is most people drop out of the purchase. They can't afford these new prices. So you have a small group of people paying high prices. Then what normally happens after that is that productivity then ramps up to provide more supply to meet the demand, and then that causes prices to start going down again. That's inflation. If you don't have shortages, you just have high prices. That means that there's plenty of supply. So that's not what's driving the high prices. What's driving high prices is people have more money, they can afford to pay higher prices, and businesses are always trying to increase their profits. So they raise prices to what the market will bear. Have you heard that expression before? Probably not. What the market will bear, that's what they will charge. And so the market is what people are willing to pay. People are willing to pay more because they have more money to spend. And they have more money to spend because unemployment is up, wages are going up. In spite of that fact, we're now having all kinds of strikes, some taking place, some threatened, because the reality is that the people at the top are making more and more and more money, and the people who are still doing pretty good in this economy, they want a bigger slice of that pie, and they're probably entitled to it, and they'll probably usually get it. But that's healthy. So we don't have shortages. We don't have people without money to spend. People are spending money. Prices are going up because people are spending money, but there's no shortages, so there's plenty around there. So when you turn on the TV and you hear them talking about, the American people are fed up with this terrible economy, well, the proof of the pudding is in the eating. The proof of the pudding is if people were fed up with this economy because they can't afford the high prices, they wouldn't be going out on trips all over the place, spending a fortune on airline tickets and gasoline at the pump. They just wouldn't do it. They'd stay home, which I'm trying to do. And frankly, I'd recommend it for the rest of them as well because it's better for your blood pressure. But having said that, I wanted to set the record straight on that. So where does this come from? This idea that the polls are telling us one thing, but the conduct of the people in the country tells us a different story. Well, it's the polls. And the most dramatic example of that was in this last election, the midterm elections, as they're euphemistically called, where the Republicans were supposed to come charging through with a red wave. And the Democrats were supposed to be clobbered. Now, first of all, where Congress is concerned, the Senate and the House, usually that does happen in an off-year election. The party that is not the party in the White House scores very well in midterm elections. That didn't happen this time. Actually, the Democrats increased their lead in the Senate, and they barely lost the House. The Republicans, according to the polls, were going to pick up a 30 or 40 seat majority in the House. Instead, they picked up a five majority, I think it was. Basically, by the thinnest of margins. And Republican politicians, and I mean that by that I mean not the elected, but I mean the people who run campaigns for Republicans, were all on the air bemoaning how miserably they did, in spite of their expectations, because the polls were completely off. So in spite of that, we're still looking at the polls and all of the TV. Well, the polls are saying that the American people are not going to vote for Joe Biden. They think he's doing a terrible job because of the terrible inflation that we have, and our economy is such a mess. Our economy overall is in the best shape it's been in a long, long time. We have record unemployment. The stock market is going gangbusters. Wages are up. Profits are up. Our GMP is just going through the roof. Economic growth is incredible. We're bringing back, largely because of Biden's administration, we're bringing back the chip manufacturing, we're bringing back infrastructure, we're bringing back all kinds of jobs to this country that have gone overseas, which is why our economy is doing better than any economy in the world today of all the advanced nations, and unadvanced nations as well, obviously. So, why are these polls so screwy? The polls used to be so accurate. I couldn't believe them. They were like spot on. If they were off by a couple of percentage points, and maybe they got the winner wrong, but those would be in razor thin margins, and they would, so if somebody wins an election by 1 point and he was predicted to lose by 2 points, that's within the margin of error, and that's the way they used to be. They're not that way anymore. And why is that? So I did a little research on polls, and it appears that among the biggest culprits are cell phones. People who would tend to side with the Democrats tend to not only own cell phones, but to monitor who's calling them. I'm in that category. I don't answer if the phone rings and I don't recognize the number, or if I see it's from some organization, or it could possibly be someone trying to sell me something, I don't answer. I say, well, aren't you afraid you'll miss an important call? No, I'm not. First place, I don't get important calls. But even if I did, I have an answer machine. So if someone calls me and it's really important, and sometimes that does happen, they leave a message. If they don't leave a message, to me, it's not important. It's not an important call. And I'm not alone in that regard. But according to the articles I've read, the people who are more likely to not take calls from pollsters are not the Republicans, which is what they've been saying. Oh, the Trump supporters won't answer the phone because they don't trust the media. No, it's people like me who are wary of getting these phone calls that waste their time, tie up their energy, invade their privacy, so they don't take them. You know who takes calls? People who still have landlines take calls. One of the reasons they do is because they don't have answer machines, they don't have any way to look to see who's calling them, and there often are elderly people, or they're people who are in rural areas, and these are people who tend to be what? The Republican base. So it used to be everybody had a landline. That's why the polling was more accurate. Now, people who get the landline calls, they answer the phone. People who get the cell phone calls tend not to answer the phone, and the ones who do answer the phones, they tend to be elderly, and they tend to be rural. They tend to be the Republican base. So that's the explanation right there why you can't believe these polls when they're saying, oh, the people think the economy is just doing terrible. Da, da, da. Well, that's sort of baked into the Republican base. If there's a Democratic president, the economy is doing terrible. Everything he does is terrible. I've seen this my whole life. You get a Democratic president in there, even Harry Truman. That was the first race I remember was Truman and Dewey in 1948. They lied about Truman all the time. They hated his guts. Harry Truman, I remember going to grammar school. Oh, Harry Truman, how could you stand him? You said your dad's a Democrat? Oh my God, you know that Harry Truman is president. This was in Indiana. So Harry Truman was just constantly eviscerated by the Republican base. Now they think he's wonderful. Why? Because he stood up to the communists, because he dropped the bomb, that was problematic in my opinion. But you know, he was seen as a tough guy who stood up for America and fought hard against communism. Even though at the time, when he was president, I remember very clearly these Republicans running around saying, yeah, Truman sold out China to the communists in return for getting a big kickback from the Chinese communists. It's just like the things they say about Biden today. There's no evidence for any of that stuff. They would just say it. And they ripped into him something awful. Now they love him. John Kennedy, the things they said about John Kennedy used to make me want to pull my hair out. And I love John Kennedy, still do. But I loved him at the time. Okay, he was a great president. I was devastated when he died. I was in college at the time. I was a sophomore. I just got my hair cut. I was like, oh my God, my life was over. It was horrible. Like everybody, it was like you walked around the campus. I was at Michigan at the time. You walked around the campus, people were just standing on street corners, just standing there. They didn't know what to do. They didn't know which way to go. The light would change. They would just stand there. And I went and took an exam the next day, and we all walked in. Nobody said a word to anybody. We all sat down, took the exam. Teacher didn't say anything. We all laid our pencils down. We all just walked out. And, you know, normally you're joking around and slapping that, talking about football. Nothing. It was just like being in a tomb. So, but the Republicans hated Kennedy when he was president. They were always telling, particularly, you know, because of the Cuban Missile Crisis. Well, he's soft on communism. He didn't go in there and bomb Cuba the way Curtis LeMay wanted him to do. So, and we now know that from Khrushchev's memoirs that if they had done that, that Russia was prepared to drop a nuclear bomb on New York. So Kennedy handled that beautifully. But boy, the Republicans at the time, this man, he's awful. This is why when Kennedy went to Dallas, people said, well, don't go to Dallas. They hate you in Texas. And they did. They hated him all over the South, primarily because he introduced the Civil Rights Bill. We can get into that discussion about that later. But they hated him in the South, particularly the Southern Democrats. They thought he was a traitor to their cause, which was the Confederacy. And now, Kennedy, oh yeah, Kennedy was a great president. Oh yeah, Kennedy. But not at the time. And I was there, and I remember, just like I was there for Truman, and I remember how these people just, there's no such thing as a good Democrat when they're in office. 30 years, 40 years after they're dead. 40 years. How old am I anyway? I don't even remember. That's how old I am. I can't even remember. But that's what you're dealing with there. So Joe Biden's the president. He's a Democrat. Doesn't matter what he does. You call into that Republican base, the rurals, a lot of the elderly. I don't know why. And there's elderly and there's elderly. I'm not a baby boomer. I'm older than the baby boomers. They're just young punk kids as far as I'm concerned. Always have been, always will be. But I'm a year older. So, because I was born during the war, I had the guts to come down here right when the war was still raging. Not like these sissy baby boomers. They waited till it was over and then they came on down. Oh, let's go down to Earth. It's like, oh, okay, God, I'm ready to go now. I was like, put me in. I couldn't care less. War, I'm there. That's the difference between the war babies and the baby boomers. Baby boomers. Sissies. So, let's get back to reality here. So sometimes I wonder about myself, and I'm sure you do too. Anyhow, that's the base. For some reason, it's not the baby boomers, because we were still most of us were, or those who were baby boomers, remember, they were the civil rights activists. They were people who demonstrated against the war in Vietnam. They were not today's conservatives. You know what the conservatives were? What generation that was? That was the Eisenhower generation. Those are the people who were like in high school when we were in grammar school. And those people were hardcore conservatives because their parents hated Roosevelt. I know, because my grandparents couldn't stand Roosevelt. So they came from that generation that didn't much care for Roosevelt, certainly didn't like Truman, loved Eisenhower. They were hardcore Republicans. Those people are now the senior citizens that they've been calling senior citizens for a while. They're now passing on. My generation's trying to pass. I lost one of my best friends the other day, a retired judge. We were buddies in law school. It was like a kick in the stomach when he died. It's happening. It's happening, folks. You just gotta get ready for it. I don't know if I'll ever be ready for it. Yeah, no. Stop it, George. Anyway, so when you look at the polls that have been skewing toward, the economy's a mess, Biden's a terrible president, when you look at where most of that's coming from, it's coming from people who still have landlines, and those people tend to be Republican oriented. And that's the only explanation I can think of based on the research I did just this morning on what's going on with polling. The people who are running polls are very concerned with the fact that they're not accurate anymore, and they're particularly concerned about how do you reach people who have cell phones. And more people are doing it. More and more people are not taking calls from pollsters. And so they tend to be skewed in a way which right now anyway tends to favor Republicans. It's inconceivable to me that you could reconcile, and here's another one where the polls are irreconcilable. A solid majority of the people in this country, including the majority of Republicans, say that if Donald Trump is convicted of a felony, he should not be qualified to serve as president of the United States. How do you reconcile that with 50% of the American people, or 51% of the American people, think he should be reelected, or reelected as president? It's just bizarre. So unfortunately, I just don't even pay any attention to polls anymore. They're just all over the place, and they're not reliable. The good news is the economy's doing fine. Joe Biden does have a problem, and the problem is he appears to be frail. He's always had a speaking problem because he's a stutterer. And I've had people say, what? He's a stutterer? What, are you making excuses for him? No, I'm not. He's a stutterer. I used to work with stutterers. I was a counselor at the University of Michigan speech therapy camp. And I can tell you, I know what they go through, and he has done a masterful job of dealing with a very, very serious problem. So he's always appeared to have problems with speaking. It's because he's a stutterer, not because he's stupid. He certainly isn't stupid. So, but he does appear to be frail with the way he walks, kind of carries himself a little bit. and then people are worried that Kamala Harris is going to take over as president if anything happens to Joe Biden, and so he's got some problems. But his problems are not that the economy is in terrible shape. Nobody really believes that. So I just was just motivated to that because of what I saw just on TV this morning, particularly seeing how many people are spending so much money on travel, while at the same time the polls are showing that people think that you can't, we're just, the gas prices are so awful and the price of airlines are so terrible. And in the meantime, they're spending money on all of these things, so they don't think it's terrible. Anyway, that's it for that, and I hope I didn't depress any of you on Labor Day. But you have a good rest of this vacation. I hope that if you're traveling, you don't get stuck in traffic, and you don't get stuck at the airport because of the millions of you who are out there running around instead of staying home and off the streets like you should. Bye.